It had been almost 15 years since I last saw my grandfather's old cabin. The last time I went there, I was barely a teenager, more interested in my phone than the creaking smell of pine and oil that clung to the place. But now, at 32, driving 3 hours north through the cracked mountain road with my dog sleeping in the back seat, the memories came back like stale air, heavy and unwelcome. My grandfather had died nearly a decade ago, but the cabin still stood, left untouched by anyone. The family never wanted to sell it, mostly because no one wanted to deal with it. It was too far, too old, and too full of things no one wanted to sort through. I told myself I was just going there for a couple of nights, to check the structure, make sure no one had broken in, and maybe clear some things out. But part of me just wanted to see it again, to remind myself that he was once real and not just a fading face in a photo album. The road leading up was rough. Wet leaves, broken branches, and the kind of silence that makes you check your mirrors more often. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky had turned gray, and fog was sinking low between the trees like smoke. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was dark and damp, and the old tin roof was rusted through in spots. The porch leaned to one side, and the front door hung slightly crooked on its frame. I stood there for a while before going in, listening to the woods. Nothing, not a single bird, just the faint ticking sound of cooling metal from my truck. My dog, Rusty, didn't seem to like it either. His tail was low, and he kept sniffing the air, pausing at the base of the steps like he was waiting for permission. Inside, everything smelled the same: mold, old newspapers, and something else under it all, like stale iron. I thought it might be rust or the water from the pipes. The furniture hadn't moved since I last saw it. The same green couch sagging in the middle, the same oil lamp on the table, the same pair of boots by the door that had once been my grandfather's. Dust coated everything. The air felt thicker than normal, like the place had been sealed shut for too long. I unpacked slowly, leaving most of my stuff near the front door. I didn't plan to stay long. There was no power, no cell signal, and no working plumbing. The only sound came from the wind pressing against the walls and the faint creak of old boards under my feet. I lit one of the old lanterns and walked through each room. The bedroom still had his bed, still made, with a faded quilt and flattened pillows. The closet door was shut, and the padlock that used to hang from it was missing. I thought that was strange because he used to keep tools in there and was always careful about locking it. When I opened the closet, I expected to see old coats or a pile of junk, but there was something different about the air inside. It smelled stronger, thicker, and the light from my lantern barely seemed to reach the back wall. A few old blankets and boxes were stacked inside, so I decided I'd sort through them the next morning when there was light. I closed it again and went outside to get some firewood. The woods behind the cabin were dense, and the ground was soft from the rain. I found some dry branches under a large fir tree and carried them back, stacking them near the fireplace. When I turned around, Rusty was standing at the door, staring inside the cabin, not moving. His ears were flat, and he was staring hard into the dark corner near the bedroom hallway. I called him over, but he didn't move until I walked up and nudged him. That's when I noticed it, the faint, sour smell drifting through the air. It was metallic and earthy, not strong but enough to make me wrinkle my nose. At first, I thought maybe an animal had died somewhere under the floor or inside the walls. The cabin had been empty for years. Mice, raccoons, anything could have crawled in. I set the wood down and tried not to think about it. That night, I slept on the couch with the lantern burning low beside me. The cabin was dead silent. No crickets, no owls, no sound of wind against the roof. Just the occasional creak of wood expanding and settling. Around midnight, Rusty lifted his head and started growling. Not barking, just a deep, steady rumble in his chest. His eyes were fixed toward the hallway again, the same direction as the closet. I sat up, trying to listen. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement, not even the sound of wind outside. But the smell was stronger now. That same metallic, earthy rot, faint but spreading. I stayed awake most of the night, dozing off only when the lantern burned out completely. When I woke up, pale light was coming through the dirty windows. The smell was still there. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my gloves and a flashlight and went to the closet. The air felt colder near that corner. When I opened the door again, the smell hit me harder. I started pulling things out, old jackets, boxes full of tools, a pile of fishing gear. The floor underneath was stained darker than the rest, and when I moved one of the boxes aside, the wood was soft, rotten. I pressed it with my boot, and the board cracked slightly, revealing something underneath. For a second, I thought it was just soil, but then I saw the edge of a fabric, brown, thick, and stiff. My stomach dropped. I crouched down, peeled back the loose wood with my hands, and saw it clearly. A coat sleeve, then part of a hand. It didn't look fresh. It was dry, sunken, the color of paper left in the rain. The fingernails were still there. I stumbled back and had to lean against the wall. My first thought was that maybe someone had buried an animal there. But it wasn't. It was a man. I didn't have to look twice to know who it was. The size of the coat, the worn leather belt, the old watch that still hung loosely on the wrist. It was my grandfather's. My whole body went cold. He wasn't buried in a cemetery. There had been a funeral, yes, but the coffin had been closed. They said he died in the hospital after a heart attack. But the body lying there, hidden under his own cabin floor, told something different. I sat there for what felt like an hour, trying to make sense of it. Why was he here? Who put him here? There was no sign of struggle in the room. No blood, nothing disturbed. It looked like he had been carefully placed there, then covered and sealed. The rest of the cabin was untouched. I went outside for air, shaking so hard I could barely light a cigarette. The trees stood still, heavy with fog. Rusty sat near the porch, watching me. He didn't bark, just looked tired, like he already knew. I walked around the back of the cabin, trying to think, but every step felt heavier. I thought about calling the police, but there was no signal and no landline. The nearest station was at least an hour's drive down the mountain. I packed my things quickly, took one last look inside the cabin, and shut the door. I didn't touch the closet again. As I drove back down the mountain road, I couldn't stop thinking about how no one ever questioned anything. The hospital papers, the funeral, the sealed coffin, it all made sense now. Someone knew. Someone had made sure he disappeared quietly. I went to the authorities the next morning. They went up there 2 days later. When they dug under the floor, they found exactly what I said. My grandfather's remains, wrapped neatly in the same coat he used to wear every day. The coroner said he'd been dead for about 10 years, but not from a heart attack. His skull had been fractured at the back, likely from a blunt object. They never found out who did it. The cabin was isolated. No neighbors, no visitors, and everyone who might have known something was long gone. The case stayed open but cold. I never went back to that place again. They tore the cabin down a few months later, burned what was left, and sealed off the property. Sometimes, though, when I drive through that region and pass the turnoff road leading up the hill, I can still remember that smell, that thick, metallic air that clung to the wood. It's strange to think that the man I thought was buried miles away was lying under that floor all along, hidden by the same walls he built with his own hands. And maybe that's the part that still gets me, the thought that someone cared just enough to hide him, but not enough to bury him right. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend a few days alone in the woods of northern Maine. I was 29 at the time, tired from working long shifts at a construction site, and my head felt heavy from months of noise, traffic, and people. I just wanted quiet. No phones, no coworkers, no one asking for anything. A friend of mine mentioned there were some old hunting cabins out past Millinocket, near an abandoned logging route. He said most of them hadn't been used for decades, but a few were still standing. That sounded perfect to me. Cheap, quiet, and isolated. I packed light, just a sleeping bag, some canned food, a flashlight, a small camping stove, a hatchet, and a few changes of clothes. My truck's radio barely caught any signal once I got past the main road, and after about 3 hours of driving through uneven gravel paths and thick forest, I reached the end of the trail. The cabin stood there, hidden between tall pines and thick undergrowth, the kind of place you'd miss unless you were looking for it. It was small, just one story, with a collapsed porch and moss creeping up the wood walls. The windows were dusty but not broken, and the door was hanging slightly crooked. There was no sign of recent human activity, though I did notice faint tire marks half covered by pine needles in the dirt nearby. The air smelled of damp earth and old wood, and the only sounds were wind brushing through the trees and the distant call of some bird. It felt oddly peaceful. Inside, the cabin was worse than I expected. Dust coated everything, thick layers on the counter, the floor, the stove. A single iron bed frame leaned against the far wall, its mattress torn open with yellow stuffing poking out. There was an old table, a couple of rusted chairs, and a wood-burning stove still half full of ash. I noticed empty cans on one shelf, beans, corn, things like that, and a cracked coffee mug sitting upside down in the sink. Everything looked untouched for years. I cleaned a little, cleared some space near the window, and set up my sleeping bag on the wooden floor. The air inside was cold and stale, so I opened the window to let in some breeze. For a few hours, I just sat outside on a fallen log, eating a can of chili, watching the forest go dim as the sun dropped behind the trees. The silence felt good. I hadn't felt that kind of quiet in a long time. When it got dark, I lit a small oil lantern I'd brought along. The light flickered against the walls, throwing uneven shadows that made the cabin look even older. I wrote a few notes in my pocket journal just about the drive, the location, and how it felt to finally get away from everything. I went to sleep not long after, the faint sound of wind outside and creaking wood lulling me. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a dull thud. First, I thought it was part of a dream. Then I heard it again, something soft but heavy hitting wood. I sat up, heart picking up speed. The lantern had gone out, and the cabin was pitch black. I could hear faint rustling outside, like something moving through the leaves. I figured it was an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a deer. I lay back down, trying to ignore it. A few minutes passed. Another sound, this time closer, maybe right outside the wall. I held my breath, listening. The air felt heavier. I told myself it was just the wind pushing branches against the siding. But then came a sharp scraping noise, slow and uneven, like something dragging metal or nails across the wood. It lasted only a few seconds, but it made my skin prickle. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up, flashlight in hand, waiting for morning. Around 4:30, when the sky started turning pale gray, I finally got up and went outside. The air was damp and cold, the ground covered with dew. I walked around the cabin, looking for prints or marks, but there was nothing. The only thing I noticed was that the back door, one I hadn't even opened, was now slightly ajar. I stood there for a while, staring at it. I didn't remember unlocking it. I spent the morning gathering some dry wood and making coffee on the small stove. The forest was quiet again, but not peaceful anymore. It felt like the silence was heavier, like something was holding its breath. Around noon, I decided to take a short hike down the trail to clear my head. The path behind the cabin led deeper into the forest, where old logging equipment still rusted among weeds. I followed it for maybe a mile until I found a clearing with a collapsed shed and what looked like an old fire pit. There were empty beer bottles scattered around, some recent, some so faded the labels had peeled away. It hit me then that maybe this cabin wasn't as abandoned as I thought. The faint tire marks, the door, the noise. Maybe someone came out here sometimes, hunters, squatters, whoever. I didn't like that thought, but I tried to shake it off. By evening, I was back at the cabin, sitting on the porch steps watching the light fade again. I could smell rain coming, thick clouds were rolling in, and thunder rumbled in the distance. I went inside, shut both doors tightly, and wedged a chair under the front one just in case the wind blew it open. The rain started around midnight, came down hard, hammering the roof and windows. The noise was so constant it drowned out everything else. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, half dozing, when I heard something that didn't fit the rhythm of the rain. A slow creak from the floorboards near the back of the room. My stomach dropped, came again. One step, then another. Slow, steady. I froze completely. The cabin was small. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. I couldn't tell if the sound was inside or coming from the porch, but it was close. I reached quietly for my flashlight, my fingers shaking, and turned it on. The beam cut through the dark and hit nothing but the wall and old furniture. The sound stopped. I stayed like that, light pointed at the door, barely breathing. The rain softened outside, and for a while, there was only silence again. But then, faintly, I heard something else, something brushing against the side of the cabin. I aimed the light toward the window, but all I could see was my own reflection and streaks of rain. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it finally did, I packed up my stuff immediately. The rain had turned the dirt path to mud, but I didn't care. I went around the cabin one last time before leaving, just to see if I was imagining everything. That's when I noticed the prints. They were boot prints, large, deep ones, in the mud right under my bedroom window. There were several of them, leading up to the wall and circling around to the back door. The same door that had been opened before. The prints were fresh, maybe just a few hours old. My chest felt tight. Whoever had been walking around out there wasn't an animal. It was a person. Maybe the same one who'd come during the night before. Maybe they'd been watching the cabin from the trees while I was inside, half asleep, thinking it was just the wind. I didn't waste another second. I got into my truck, turned it around, and drove until I hit the main road. I didn't stop, not even to eat, until I was back in town. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up old records at the local library, just something to put my mind at ease. I found a small newspaper clipping from 1986 about a missing hunter named Raymond Collins who disappeared somewhere near Millinocket. They never found him, just his truck and some camping supplies near one of the old logging trails. The article mentioned a cabin about 10 miles north of where I'd stayed. I don't know if it was the same one. I didn't go back to check, but I remember those footprints, how deep they were in the mud, how close they came to the window where I slept. Whoever it was had stood there for a long time, close enough to see inside. I still think about that sometimes. How quiet it was that night, how the forest swallowed every sound except those slow, heavy steps. I went there looking for peace and silence. I found it, but not the kind I wanted. It was the kind that watches you from the dark and waits for you to realize you're not alone. It was October of 2013 when I decided to spend a few quiet days alone at a small cabin near the Arizona-New Mexico border. I'd been working long hours at a construction site in Flagstaff, and I just needed time away from everything: people, noise, and work. My cousin had this old cabin sitting empty on a patch of dry land surrounded by hills and scattered pine trees. It wasn't much, just a square wooden box with one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a front porch that leaned slightly to one side. It didn't have electricity, just a propane stove and a few oil lamps. That was fine with me. I wanted silence. I arrived on a Friday evening just before sunset. The air was cold and dry, and the ground crunched under my boots. There was a stillness I hadn't felt in a long time. No wind, no cars, just the faint creak of the porch boards as I brought my bags inside. The cabin smelled like dust and pine resin. The floorboards were rough and uneven, and the windows had streaks of dirt across them that blurred the fading sunlight. I remember thinking it felt peaceful, but in a lonely way, like time didn't really move there. I had brought my dog, Max, a German Shepherd I'd had for about 4 years. He was calm but alert, always sniffing around. As soon as we stepped inside, he began pacing, sniffing near the door and the corners, tail stiff. I figured he was just smelling the place, maybe catching the scent of mice or an old animal trail outside. That night, after unpacking, I cooked some beans on the stove and sat on the porch to eat. The sun dropped fast behind the ridge, and within minutes, everything turned black except for the outline of the pines against the sky. There weren't any streetlights or cabins nearby, just darkness and silence stretching miles in every direction. I didn't have any phone signal either. I had a flashlight, a lantern, and a battery-powered radio, but I kept them off for a while just to listen to the quiet. That's when I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. A soft crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves about 20 or 30 feet away from the cabin. Max lifted his head and stared into the dark. His ears pointed forward and his body stiffened. I stood up slowly, looking in the same direction, but I couldn't see anything. The night was too black. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a coyote. There were plenty around that area. A few minutes passed. Nothing else happened, and Max eventually laid back down, though he kept glancing at the same spot outside. I tried to ignore it, finished my food, and went inside. Before bed, I locked the front door and checked the windows. The place had old wooden shutters instead of curtains, and when I closed them, the cabin became completely dark inside. I left the lantern on low near the bed, just enough to see shapes. Sometime after midnight, Max started growling. A low, steady growl, not loud, but deep enough that I woke instantly. He was standing near the door, hackles raised, staring at it like something was right outside. I held my breath and listened. There was movement, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, crunching on gravel and twigs. Then silence. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it at the door. The metal latch rattled slightly, just once, like someone touched it. Max barked, sharp and fast, and the sound outside stopped completely. I didn't move for almost an hour, just listening. Nothing came after that, and I must have eventually dozed off sitting up. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I saw footprints in the dirt, bare feet. They circled the cabin. Some prints were deep, others faint, as if whoever it was had moved slowly around the walls. The strange part was how long the footprints were, maybe twice the size of mine, but narrow, almost too narrow for a human foot. I just stood there for a long time staring at them, trying to think logically. Maybe they were stretched by the rain or wind, maybe a trick of light, but the dirt was still damp from the cold night, and those prints looked fresh. I spent the day trying to distract myself, chopping some old firewood, taking a short hike down to the creek about half a mile away, trying to convince myself it was all nothing. Max stayed close to me the whole time. He never strayed off, and every time a branch snapped in the distance, his head turned sharply. I remember feeling watched even though I couldn't see anyone. That night, I double-checked every lock and even dragged a small table in front of the door. I kept my flashlight in one hand and an old hunting knife on the table. I didn't plan to sleep much. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time not footsteps, but a soft, wet dragging sound near the window. like someone was sliding their hand slowly down the wood outside. Max growled, deeper than before, and the lantern flickered. Then came a faint whistle. Not a tune, just one long note, like someone testing if I'd react. I froze. Every part of me went cold. I didn't move or breathe for several seconds. Then I slowly reached up and turned off the lantern. The cabin went pitch black. I sat there in the dark, holding the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. The sound outside moved again, this time around the back of the cabin. Then something heavy brushed against the wall, almost like a shoulder or body. Max barked, loud and sharp, lunging toward the window. I finally turned on the light, but by the time I got the courage to open the shutter just a crack, there was nothing there. Just darkness and the faint outline of trees. The next morning, I saw it again. Footprints, only now there were more, leading down toward the tree line. I followed them for about 50 feet before they disappeared into rocky ground. That's when I noticed something caught on a branch nearby. What looked like a piece of torn skin or hide, grayish and dry. I didn't touch it. It looked almost human but stretched too thin, like old leather. By the third night, I was done pretending it was nothing. I decided to leave in the morning, first thing at sunrise. I kept the lantern burning all night and sat with my back to the wall. Around 2 a.m., the noise started again. Soft steps, not running, just slow and steady, circling the cabin over and over. Then, for the first time, I heard breathing through the cracks of the door. Not panting, just slow, heavy breaths, like someone standing inches away. I didn't move. I didn't even look at the door. I could hear Max trembling, growling low but not barking this time. After a few minutes, the breathing stopped, and I heard the faintest sound of something scraping the door, like nails dragging down the wood. I sat there all night, wide awake, listening to every sound until the sun finally came up. When light finally spilled into the room, I opened the door and saw long, thin scratch marks running down the middle of it. Not deep, but clear. I packed everything fast and loaded Max into the truck. Before leaving, I looked one last time at the cabin. From the dirt road, I could still see the prints circling it, going around and around, overlapping each other like someone had walked there all night. As I drove away, I glanced in the mirror. At the edge of the tree line, I saw movement. Something standing there, tall, still, almost blending into the bark of the pines. It wasn't moving, just watching. I didn't slow down. I never went back to that cabin. My cousin later told me that locals around that area didn't stay out there overnight. They said things came down from the mesas sometimes. Things that weren't animals, but not quite people either. I didn't care to ask more. Even now, when I think back to those 3 nights, I can still hear that slow breathing through the door and the soft crunch of footsteps circling the cabin. I tell myself it had to be a person, someone playing tricks, or a drifter living in the woods. But no matter how many times I try to explain it, I can't forget those long, narrow footprints, bare feet pressing into the cold dirt, right outside where I slept. It was the fall of 1998 when I got assigned to the north section of Cragview National Park in northern Montana. I was 31 at the time, and I'd been a park ranger for almost 6 years. I'd worked in places much harsher than Cragview. Dry desert posts, long mountain patrols, but nothing ever sat quite right with me about that area. The trees grew too close together. The fog hung longer in the valleys, and at night, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that pressed against your ears until you could hear your own heartbeat. The cabin they gave me sat near a steep ridge about 20 minutes from the main ranger station. It was built in the early 70s, single room, small kitchenette with stove, and a back door that didn't quite shut all the way unless you lifted it first. There was a short trail leading down to a stream and an old wooden radio antenna nailed to the roof for contact with base. It was enough for what I needed. I was used to being alone, and it was just another assignment. At least that's what I told myself. The first few days passed quietly. My routine was simple: check the northern trails, log wildlife sightings, keep an eye on campfire zones, and report weather changes. The forest that time of year was heavy with color: deep reds, brown leaves, and yellow patches of grass bending under frost. I'd return each evening before the sun disappeared, make coffee, write down my notes, and read until my lantern dimmed. But after the fourth night, I started noticing things that didn't add up. The first was the noise outside my cabin, a kind of dull thump, like someone dropping a heavy log on wet ground. It came from different directions, never the same twice, always after midnight. I assumed it was an elk or a bear, but when I went out the next morning to look, there were no tracks. The ground was damp enough that even a rabbit left prints. Yet I found nothing but old leaves flattened by rain. On the sixth day, I hiked toward the upper ridge trail to inspect a report of fallen trees. About 2 miles in, I came across a small clearing that wasn't marked on my map. It looked unnatural, too circular, as if the trees had been cut down years ago and never grew back. In the middle of it was what looked like an old campsite: a burnt fire ring, a torn tarp, and a single boot half buried in the mud. It wasn't recent. The leather had cracked from years of weather. Still, it felt strange. No reports mentioned anyone being lost in that area, and even old logging crews didn't go that far off trail. I radioed in to note it, then turned back toward the cabin. The forest was still that afternoon. No birds, no wind, not even the faint rustle of small animals. It's odd how silence can start to feel alive after a while. Every step I took, I could hear the soft crush of dirt and leaf under my boots, like it was echoing louder than it should. That night, the noise came again. Louder, closer. I woke up just after 2 a.m. to that same heavy thud, followed by a dragging sound along the gravel path that led up to my door. My flashlight was weak from the cold, but I still grabbed it and stepped outside. The fog was thick, the kind that swallowed light whole. The beam barely reached 5 feet ahead of me. The air was damp and cold enough to sting. There were long drag marks in the gravel, moving across my front yard and disappearing into the brush near the tree-line. They looked like something had been pulled, maybe a log, but I hadn't cut or moved any wood that week. I followed them a short distance until they vanished into the leaves. I stood there for a while, waiting to hear anything else. An animal, a branch breaking, but the forest was completely still. I went back inside, locked both doors, and didn't sleep until the light came through the window. The next morning, I walked the perimeter with my rifle slung over my shoulder. About 100 yards from the cabin, I found a pile of old wood, small logs stacked neatly against a rock. It wasn't mine. I hadn't gathered any firewood yet. There were faint shoe prints around it too, but only one set. The soles were flat, smooth, not hiking boots. They looked like work shoes, the kind people wore around camps or garages. I wrote it all down in my logbook, unsure what to make of it. That afternoon, I checked in with the ranger base. They hadn't sent anyone near my area in over a week. No hikers had permits for the upper North Ridge either. I didn't report the strange noises. I didn't want to sound paranoid. You learn early on in this job that people who spend too long alone in the woods start to imagine things. I told myself that's all it was. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of something hitting the side of the cabin. A quick, sharp knock, like wood striking wood. Then silence. Then it happened again. I turned on the lantern, got up, and listened. I could hear soft shuffling outside, like feet moving slowly through damp leaves. I didn't open the door. Instead, I stood there, watching the doorknob, waiting. After a few minutes, it stopped. In the morning, there were muddy footprints right up to the steps. They were clear this time, size 11, maybe 12, and deep enough to show weight. They led around the cabin, circled once, and disappeared back into the woods. I checked my watchtower log. The temperature had dropped to 31 that night. Whoever it was, they were out there freezing, walking in near silence. By the 10th day, I barely slept. I kept the lantern burning until dawn, checking outside every hour. My food stock was low, and I started to feel the cold sink into my hands and joints. I planned to leave for the main station the next morning. I just needed one more clear day to make the hike safely. That night, I packed my things early: gear bag, radio, journal, a small revolver I kept sealed in the drawer. I made coffee, sat at the table, and tried to stay awake. Around 3 a.m., the cabin shook. It wasn't strong, but enough to rattle the lantern and knock the mug from the table. The sound came from the back door, a single hard impact, then a faint creak. I waited, heart pounding. Then came the dragging sound again, circling the cabin, slow and steady. I didn't open the door this time. I stood by the wall, holding my breath, listening to the crunch of gravel and the low scraping that seemed to move all the way around before stopping near the front steps. The silence afterward felt heavy, almost painful. I could feel sweat running down my neck even though the air was cold. Eventually, the noise faded. I stayed awake until daylight, then stepped outside. The fog had lifted, and the ground was covered in frost. The drag marks were fresh again, this time deeper, circling the cabin twice before heading into the trees. I followed them down the trail for about a quarter mile until they ended at a half-frozen pond. The water was still perfectly clear, and near the edge were piles of rotting wood, half of them broken, as if something had been stacking them and stopped halfway through. I never found any sign of who or what had done it. No footprints past that point, no tools, no tire tracks. Just the quiet pond, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean closer the longer I stood there. I left that afternoon, packed my gear, locked the cabin, and hiked the 6 miles back to the main station without stopping. I didn't tell anyone the details, just said I'd been hearing animals at night and found strange debris. They reassigned me to the southern range a few weeks later. I went back once 2 years later during summer patrol. The cabin was still there, but the door was wide open, the inside scattered with leaves. The wood pile near the back wall was gone, replaced by small mounds of dirt like something had been buried and dug up again. The forest around it was quiet, still as I remembered. I stood there for a while, just listening. It was the same silence, thick, empty, pressing. I didn't go inside. I turned around and walked back down the trail, not looking over my shoulder once. Sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, I still think about that sound. The dragging through gravel, slow and steady, circling in the dark. I can still hear it clear as day, even after all these years. And every time I do, I remind myself why I never took another northern post again. It was the summer of 2014 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone in a small wooden cabin I had rented in the northern part of Maine. I was 31 then, burned out from work, tired of city noise, and just needed silence. I'd found the cabin through an old listing online. Cheap, secluded, and surrounded by dense woods that looked endless. The owner was an older man who barely said much in the emails, only that the place had running water, a small wood stove, and a working generator if the power went out. That was enough for me. The cabin was at the end of a long dirt road that stretched for miles without a single sign or house. When I first drove there, it was already late afternoon. The trees on both sides of the road were so close they almost touched the sides of my car. The sound of gravel under the tires was the only thing breaking the silence. My cell signal had dropped off about an hour earlier, and the GPS froze, but I kept following the road until I saw the small wooden sign that said, Pine Hollow Cabin. It was tilted and old, barely standing. The cabin itself was small but decent. One main room with a bed in the corner, a small kitchen space with an old gas stove, and a table by the single window that looked out over a narrow clearing. Out back there was a small shed and a trail that led deeper into the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Inside, everything was quiet, still, and slightly colder than outside. The floor creaked when I walked, and the walls seemed to hum faintly with the sound of the wind moving through the trees. That first night was peaceful. I unpacked, ate canned soup, and sat outside on the porch watching the light fade through the trees. I hadn't realized how quiet real silence could be until then. No traffic, no voices, not even distant sounds, just the wind. But as it got darker, that quiet began to feel heavy, almost like the air itself was thicker. I went to bed early, but the night was restless. The forest was alive in its own way. Occasional snapping branches, the sound of something moving through dry leaves, maybe a deer. I kept telling myself that. The second day, I hiked around the area, trying to get familiar with the trails. I found a small stream a little way down the hill and a half-broken wooden bench near it, probably left by someone who'd fished there years ago. It was peaceful during the day, the kind of peace I'd been craving. But I noticed something odd when I got back to the cabin. My car door was open, not wide, but just enough that it wasn't how I left it. I stood there for a long minute, staring at it, trying to remember if maybe I had forgotten to shut it properly. Nothing inside looked touched, and my keys were still in my pocket. I brushed it off as carelessness and closed it. Still, the feeling stuck with me all evening. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept hearing soft crunching noises outside the cabin, like footsteps on the gravel. They'd stop for a while, then start again. Could have been animals. It had to be. I looked out the window once, but the porch light barely reached past the first few feet, and beyond that was just darkness. I didn't sleep much that night either. The third morning I went out early, planning to hike farther, maybe up the ridge I'd seen from the clearing. The air smelled wet, like rain was coming. About half an hour into the walk, I found something strange again. A torn piece of blue tarp tangled in a bush, and nearby, an old boot half buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for a long time, but something about it unsettled me. The way the ground looked disturbed, the faint marks of footprints leading away. Human ones, not animal. I didn't stay out long after that. When I got back, I checked the car again. This time it was fine, but the shed behind the cabin caught my attention. The door was slightly open, and I knew for sure I hadn't gone in there since arriving. Inside, it was dark and smelled like old wood and damp soil. There were rusty tools hanging on nails, a broken chair, and a couple of empty gas cans. But what bothered me most was the floor. It looked recently disturbed, like someone had been digging. A small pile of fresh dirt was heaped near the back wall. That night, the sounds outside returned, louder this time. I could hear something brushing against the cabin walls, slow, careful movements. I turned off the lantern and sat still, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped completely. I waited for maybe an hour, listening. Nothing. Then, just as I was starting to calm down, I heard the faint click of something metallic, like a door handle being tested. The sound came from the back door that led toward the shed. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, holding my flashlight, waiting. After a while, the sound stopped. No footsteps walking away, no crunching leaves, just silence. I waited until the first light of dawn came through the window before I dared to go outside. There were footprints, faint but clear enough in the damp soil behind the cabin. They led from the tree line straight to the back door, then around toward the side of the house. The prints were from boots, not animal paws. I followed them a short way until they disappeared into the thicker brush. My stomach turned when I realized they weren't mine. The size was smaller, maybe someone shorter, lighter. By the fourth day, I was done pretending it was nothing. I packed my bag early, planning to leave that evening, but I wanted to wait until the sun started to go down because I needed daylight for the road. The cabin felt different that day, heavier, like the walls were holding their breath. I stayed inside most of the day, just waiting. Around sunset, I went out to load my things into the car, but the driver's side tire was flat. I knelt down to look closer and saw a clean slit across the rubber, like it had been cut with a knife. My chest went cold. I looked around, scanning the tree line, the clearing, the shed. Everything was still, but I knew someone had done it on purpose. Whoever had been around the cabin at night wasn't just wandering. They wanted me to stay put. I went back inside, locked the doors, and pushed the table against the front one. The generator was low on fuel, so the lights flickered weakly before I shut them off. I sat by the window with the flashlight in my hand, watching the clearing as darkness settled again. Around midnight, I heard it, soft footsteps again, then the creak of the shed door. The beam of a small flashlight flickered between the trees, moving slowly, too slowly, like whoever it was knew I was watching. They circled the cabin once. I could hear the faint sound of breathing outside the wall nearest the bed. Then silence. I didn't move for hours. My throat was dry, my muscles stiff, every sound of the forest sending a jolt through my chest. Eventually, the footsteps faded away toward the woods. When the sun came up, I went outside. The footprints were there again, fresh in the wet dirt, leading back toward the trees. I didn't even think twice. I packed what I could carry and started walking down the road, leaving the car and everything behind. It took me nearly 3 hours to reach the main highway. The first passing truck stopped for me, and I told the driver my car had broken down and that I needed to get to town. I didn't tell him anything else. When I got back a few days later with a tow service, the car was gone. So was the generator. The shed door was open again, and the floor inside looked different, freshly disturbed, like something had been buried or dug up. I didn't go closer. I told the police about it, but they didn't find much. They said maybe it was vandalism or squatters. Maybe, but I know what I felt those nights. The sound of those slow, deliberate footsteps, the way the walls seemed to listen. Whoever was out there knew I was alone. And I can still see those footprints in my head, small and careful, circling the cabin in the dark. I never went back to Maine after that. I sold everything I'd left behind and didn't ask for the deposit back. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about that shed, about what might be buried under that damp floor. I'll never know. But what scares me most isn't that someone was there. It's that they might still be, waiting for the next person who thinks they just want some peace and quiet in the woods. It was late October, the kind of evening when the air already smelled like winter, sharp and dry, and the trees around my small cabin had started shedding most of their leaves. I had driven up here 2 days earlier, planning to stay for a week to get some quiet time away from everything. The cabin sat deep in the woods of northern Montana, about 5 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by nothing but thick pine forest and old dirt trails that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I brought my 2 dogs with me, Rex, my old German Shepherd, and Luna, a younger mixed breed I'd adopted last year. They were good company, and I always felt safer with them around, especially in places this isolated. The cabin wasn't fancy. It was small, built out of old timber with a tin roof that made noise every time the wind picked up. Inside, it was warm and plain. Just a single room with a bed, a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a table pushed against the window. I liked it that way. No phone service, no traffic, no one around. Just the forest and me. That evening, it started raining just after sunset. A slow and steady kind of rain that made a dull sound against the roof. I made myself some coffee, put on a heavy jacket, and sat out on the porch for a bit, watching the trees sway. The dogs stayed close to me, lying by my feet, quiet and calm. By the time I went inside, it was pitch dark except for the dim light from the lamp on the table. I could hear the wind picking up and the sound of branches scraping lightly against the side of the cabin. I didn't think much of it at first. Wind always sounded louder out here. But then, around 10 or so, both dogs suddenly got up and stood near the door, staring out through the small window like they heard something. Their ears were straight up, and Rex let out a low growl that made my chest tighten a little. I turned off the lamp and listened. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the wind and the rain. Then, faintly, there was another sound, like someone walking in the wet leaves just beyond the porch. I stayed still, waiting, hoping it was just a deer. The footsteps stopped. Luna let out a soft whine and backed away from the door. I went to grab my flashlight and the small hunting knife I kept on the counter. When I shined the light through the window, all I could see were streaks of rain sliding down the glass and the faint outline of the trees swaying in the dark. Nothing else. After a minute, I convinced myself it must have been an animal. Out here, coyotes, elk, even stray dogs sometimes wandered close to cabins. I turned the light off and tried to settle back down, but the dogs wouldn't calm. They stayed alert for almost an hour, moving around the door, sniffing, listening. Every now and then, Rex would give a short, low bark and then go quiet again. Around midnight, they finally lay back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been outside. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and kept the flashlight near the bed. Took a long time before I fell asleep. When I woke up, it was still raining, though lighter now. The morning light came in weak through the gray sky. I stepped outside with the dogs to let them roam a bit, and that's when I saw it. Muddy footprints by the side of the cabin. Human footprints, not mine. The shape was clear, and they were fresh enough that the rain hadn't fully washed them away yet. They led from the back of the cabin to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared among the wet leaves. My stomach tightened. I checked around the cabin, looking for any signs of a break-in, but nothing was damaged. The door was still locked. No windows broken. It didn't make sense. I spent most of that day trying to shake the uneasy feeling. I told myself maybe someone had passed through the night before, maybe a hunter or a lost hiker. But that didn't explain why they were walking so close to the cabin, or why the dogs had reacted the way they did. Still, I stayed because packing up and leaving didn't feel right either. I tried to distract myself by chopping wood and cleaning up the cabin. By the evening, I almost managed to calm down. The rain stopped, and the woods looked still again. But I kept the dogs inside that night. Around 11 p.m., just as I was about to doze off, Rex started growling again, louder this time. Luna barked once, sharp and sudden, and then ran to the window. I jumped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. The sound came again, the same soft, steady crunch of footsteps moving slowly through the wet ground outside. This time, I didn't hesitate. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch, shining the light around. The beam cut through the darkness, catching the rain that had started again. For a few seconds, I saw nothing but trees and fog. Then, just at the edge of the woods, the light caught movement. Something or someone slipping behind a tree. Human shape, no doubt. My throat went dry. I yelled out, trying to sound confident even though I was shaking inside. But the only reply was the sound of the rain hitting the leaves. Rex barked furiously now, teeth bared, ready to charge if I let him. I kept the light steady toward the trees, watching, waiting. After a few seconds, the sound faded away into the woods again. Whoever it was, they'd backed off. I stayed outside for a few minutes, scanning the tree line, before going back in and locking everything again. I couldn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair near the window all night, watching, waiting, the dogs beside me. When morning came, I checked again. More footprints, this time clearer, closer to the porch. I could see the pattern of worn-out shoes, maybe work boots. I followed them a little way into the trees, heart pounding, until they vanished again near the stream. There was no way I imagined it now. Someone had been coming here, circling the cabin, watching, maybe testing the locks. I thought about leaving right then, but the road out was rough, and the ground was soaked from 2 days of rain. My truck might get stuck, so I decided to wait until it dried up a bit, just one more night. That last night was the hardest. I didn't turn off any lights. I kept my knife on the table and the flashlight in my hand. The dogs barely slept either. Around 2 in the morning, Rex started pacing, restless. Then came the sound again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heartbeat was so loud I could barely hear the rain. I stood still, barely breathing. The steps stopped by the back wall. Then I heard the faintest scrape, like metal against wood. Someone was trying the window latch. That was it. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the window, and for just a split second, I saw him. A man soaked, his clothes dark with rain, face pale and blank, eyes wide like he wasn't expecting me to be looking back. He turned and ran into the woods without a word. I stayed awake until dawn, holding the knife, every sound making me jump. When the light finally came, I packed everything fast. I didn't even finish my coffee. I loaded the dogs and left, tires spinning through the wet mud until I reached the gravel road. I didn't look back once. Later, when I told the sheriff's office in the nearest town, they sent a deputy to check it out. He called me later that day and said they found clear signs that someone had been staying out there for a while. An old campsite about 100 yards behind the cabin, hidden between the trees. They found food wrappers, a torn blanket, and a small axe. He said it looked like someone had been living out there off and on for months, maybe longer. That night, back at home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea that while I slept, someone had been out there in the dark, walking around, watching, waiting. The dogs stayed close to me for days after, quiet but alert. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I still think about it sometimes. The way the rain sounded on that roof, the empty woods around it, the footprints by the porch. And even though I never saw that man again, I can't forget the look in his eyes that night. It wasn't anger or madness. It was something worse. It was like he'd been there so long, hiding in those woods, that he didn't know how to be seen anymore. It had been nearly 7 years since my ex-husband, Mark, passed away. Even after all that time, I still remembered the look of that cabin. His cabin, tucked deep in the woods of northern Montana. I hadn't been there since before he died. We used to spend our summers there, trying to save a marriage that was already falling apart. He always said that cabin gave him peace, that it was his escape from the noise of the world. I used to think it was just a place where he went to avoid me. The divorce was messy. After it, I moved down to Missoula, found a small apartment, got a job at a veterinary clinic, and tried to keep my head down. When Mark died, I didn't go to the funeral. I told people I was too busy, but the truth was that I couldn't face the idea of standing near his grave, surrounded by people pretending they understood what we had been through. He died alone in that same cabin, heart attack, they said. His brother found him 3 days later after the mail piled up at his door in town. I thought I had put it all behind me until last month when I got a letter from his brother saying that the cabin was still in Mark's name. Since we never officially transferred ownership after the divorce, half of it still legally belonged to me. He wanted me to go through whatever personal items were left before they sold the property. I tried to ignore the letter, but it stuck in my mind like a splinter. A week later, I packed a duffel bag, filled my truck with gas, and drove north. The drive took nearly 6 hours. By the time I turned off the highway onto the old dirt road, the sky was already dim. I remembered that road too well. The tight turns, the tall pine trees pressing in on both sides, the way the light never really reached the ground. The gravel crunched under the tires, the forest silent except for the distant call of a raven somewhere above. I kept thinking about what I would find there. Maybe the cabin was empty, maybe it was full of the same things he left behind. Maybe it still smelled like him, like tobacco and pine and engine oil. When I reached the clearing, the cabin stood just as I remembered it, though more worn down. The wood had darkened, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch steps creaked when I stepped on them. The windows were clouded with dust. My stomach felt heavy as I pushed the door open. It wasn't locked. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and dampness. The living room looked exactly how it did the last time I was there. Same leather chair by the window, same small wood stove, same old deer head mounted above the fireplace. The difference was the silence. There was no Mark sitting by the fire, no sound of him tinkering with tools or humming along to the radio. Just stillness. Dust coated everything. A stack of magazines sat on the table, curled at the edges. A mug, still stained from old coffee, rested beside it. I stood there for a while, staring at the spot where he used to sit every evening, rubbing his temples after working all day in the woods. It felt strange, like walking into someone else's memory. I started moving through the cabin, checking what was left. The small kitchen was cluttered, dishes piled in the sink, half-used cans of beans in the pantry, bottles of motor oil on the counter for some reason. I found his old flannel jacket hanging by the back door. I ran my fingers over it, the fabric stiff and cold. For a second, I thought about taking it with me, but I set it back down. In the bedroom, the bed was unmade, sheets stiff from dust. His boots were still beside it, caked with old mud. The drawers were filled with clothes, papers, random things he always collected: maps, hunting licenses, old receipts, broken watches. I found one of his notebooks in the nightstand, full of messy handwriting. Most of it was just lists, repairs he needed to make, supplies he needed to buy, but one note caught my eye. It said, in his rough scrawl, "Keep the traps closer this year. Coyotes are coming too close." I remembered those traps. He used to set them around the property to keep animals away from the chickens he kept out back. He hated coyotes, said they were thieves, that they always came closer when the weather turned cold. I felt a small chill run down my spine thinking of it, but I kept going. It was late afternoon by the time I went outside again. The air had that sharp bite of late October, the kind that creeps into your bones. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I could hear my own footsteps crunching the dead leaves. I walked behind the cabin toward the shed. The lock was rusted, but it gave after a hard pull. Inside, it smelled of oil and damp wood. Tools hung along the wall, covered in dust. There were stacks of old animal traps in a corner, some bent out of shape, others still sharp. Then I noticed the newer ones, clean metal, shiny and oiled. That didn't make sense. No one had been here in years, not since Mark died. I crouched down and touched one. It was cold, but the oil on it was fresh. I looked around the shed again. A half-empty can of chewing tobacco sat on the workbench. It wasn't there before. My chest tightened as I stood up. I told myself someone must have been maintaining the place. Maybe his brother, maybe a hunter using the property without permission. Still, something about it felt off. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch. The sun was dropping fast, the room filling with shadows. I decided I'd spend the night just to get it over with in the morning. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the couch, lit one of the old lanterns, and sat there listening to the faint sound of wind outside. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, distant, like something metallic snapping shut. I held my breath, then silence again. I told myself it was just a branch falling or the wind shifting something outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. I got up quietly, grabbed the lantern, and peeked through the window. The clearing was dark, just faint moonlight filtering through the trees. Nothing moved. Then I saw it. Something small lying near the edge of the treeline. I squinted and realized it was one of the traps. It had been dragged out there. My hands trembled slightly as I locked the door tighter and sat back down. I didn't sleep again that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me flinch. When morning finally came, I packed my things quickly. I walked outside to take one last look before leaving. The ground near the treeline had fresh prints. Boot prints, deep in the dirt, not mine. They led toward the shed and disappeared into the woods. I followed them for a few steps before stopping. They weren't old. The edges were sharp, the soil still soft inside them. Whoever it was, they'd been there during the night. I felt my throat tighten as I looked around. The forest was still silent, not even a bird. I backed away slowly and returned to the truck. Before I left, I looked once more at the cabin. The place looked different now. It wasn't just a reminder of a man I used to love. It felt like something that didn't want to be left behind, something that had stayed alive even after he was gone. Maybe Mark wasn't the only one who'd made that cabin his home. As I drove away, the narrow dirt road winding through the pines, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The cabin faded behind the trees, but the image of those fresh footprints stayed in my mind. When I reached the main highway and the forest opened up, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I didn't mention the fresh traps or the prints. I just told his brother the place was empty, ready to sell. But even now, weeks later, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can still smell that damp wood and oil. Sometimes I dream of those footprints leading up to the porch, stopping right at the door, facing inward. And when I wake up, I always check my own door, just to make sure it's still locked. It was the fall of 2012 when I drove up to a small cabin in northern Montana, about 30 miles from the nearest town. The cabin wasn't mine, but I had rented it for a few weeks after quitting my job. I needed to clear my head, get away from people, and maybe find a bit of peace in the quiet of the woods. The place sat at the edge of a lake, surrounded by thick pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight during the day. The gravel road leading up to it was rough, covered in mud and potholes, and my truck barely made it without bottoming out. By the time I got there, the sun was already low, the air cool and heavy with the smell of wet earth and with smoke from some distant cabin. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy. It had dark wooden siding, a tin roof that looked newer than the rest of the place, and a narrow porch that faced the lake. The landlord had told me there was no cell service out there, just a radio in case of emergencies. I didn't mind that. I wanted silence. Inside, the cabin was simple, a small kitchen, a living area with an old wood stove, and a single bedroom in the back. Everything smelled faintly of damp wood and dust. There were old photos still hanging on the walls of people fishing or posing in front of the same lake. Probably the previous owners or maybe families who stayed there long before I did. The first few days went by quietly. I spent my time splitting firewood, taking walks along the lakeshore, and writing in a notebook I had brought. At night, I'd sit on the porch and listen to the crickets, sometimes the distant call of a loon echoing from across the water. It felt peaceful in a way that made me realize how noisy my life had been before. But after the fourth night, things started to feel off. Not in a supernatural way, just a strange awareness that I wasn't completely alone out there. It began with small things. One morning, I noticed fresh boot prints near the back of the cabin, coming from the direction of the woods. They were deep in the mud, definitely not mine, and they stopped about 10 feet from the porch. I thought maybe it was a hunter passing through, but the prints didn't lead anywhere else, just to the cabin, and then they ended. I brushed it off, told myself it was old tracks that got softened by the rain overnight. But later that same evening, while I was chopping firewood, I caught a faint smell of cigarette smoke. The woods were too wet for anyone to be camping nearby, and I hadn't seen another person in days. Still, I saw no one, heard nothing but the wind. That night, I locked the door before going to bed, something I hadn't bothered doing before. The cabin creaked and settled as usual, but around midnight, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching outside. Slow, uneven steps, like someone walking around the truck. I lay there for a long time, not moving, listening. The sound stopped after a while, and I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check, and there were footprints again. They circled the cabin this time, some of them leading right up to my window. I felt a cold sort of unease in my chest as I stood there looking at them. Whoever it was had been right next to where I slept. I walked around the area, half expecting to find cigarette butts or something else, but there was nothing. I decided to drive into town that day, just to see if anyone had been around the area recently. The man at the small store told me hunting season had ended a week ago and nobody was supposed to be out there. I didn't tell him much, just bought some more canned food and went back before it got dark. When I returned, I noticed something strange right away. The firewood I had stacked by the side of the cabin was scattered all over the ground. Some of the logs had been tossed a few yards away like someone kicked through the pile. My first thought was maybe an animal, maybe a bear, but the pieces were too neatly broken apart, too deliberate. I spent the next hour cleaning it up, trying not to think about how human it looked. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound made me sit up. The rustling of trees, the creaking of the floorboards, even the lake water moving against the shore. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach twist. Lying on the porch was a dead rabbit. Its neck was broken clean, not torn or chewed like an animal kill. It had been placed right in the middle of the steps. I didn't know what to do, so I buried it behind the cabin and tried to convince myself it was some kind of weird coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Over the next few days, I started to notice signs that someone was coming around while I was gone. The door would feel slightly different when I unlocked it, like it had been opened and reclosed. Once, the small lantern on the table had been moved from one corner to another. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, just small, deliberate shifts. Whoever it was didn't want to steal anything. They just wanted me to know they had been there. I stopped leaving the cabin much after that. I kept the radio nearby, even though I never used it. The only thing that made me feel somewhat secure was the old hunting rifle hanging above the door. I hadn't planned to use it, but I cleaned it, loaded it, and kept it by my bed. Nights became longer and heavier. The sound of footsteps outside became familiar, slow, circling, sometimes stopping for minutes at a time. I couldn't see anything through the windows because it was always too dark, and I didn't dare turn on the lights. One night, just before dawn, I finally saw him. The light from the moon caught a figure standing between the trees, facing the cabin. He wasn't close enough for me to see his face clearly, but I could make out a dark jacket, a cap pulled low. He didn't move. I stood there frozen by the window, barely breathing. I don't know how long he stayed there. Maybe minutes, maybe longer. But eventually, he turned and disappeared into the woods. By morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things fast, not even finishing my coffee. When I went outside, the air was still and silent, like the world was holding its breath. I walked around the cabin one last time, just to make sure nothing was left behind. That's when I noticed a thin piece of wood nailed to the back wall, something I swear hadn't been there before. It was an old board, and someone had carved words into it. Just one word, stay. The letters were rough, uneven, dug deep into the wood like with a knife. I didn't stay to think about it. I threw my bags into the truck and started driving. The road felt longer on the way out, twisting through miles of thick trees before finally opening up near the highway. When I reached town, I stopped at the same small store and told the man there about what had been happening. He said there used to be a drifter around those parts years ago, someone who'd camped out near the old cabins and scared people off. Nobody ever caught him, but hunters sometimes found signs of his camps deep in the woods. I left Montana that same day. I never told anyone else about it after that, and I never went back. But sometimes late at night, when I see the shape of trees against the window or smell cigarette smoke drift in from somewhere outside, I remember that cabin, the quiet lake, the sound of slow footsteps in the dark, and the way that single word looked carved into the wood behind me. It still makes my stomach tighten when I think about how deliberate it all felt, how whoever he was didn't want to hurt me, at least not yet. He just wanted me to know he was there and that he could come back anytime he wanted. That's the part that still sticks with me the most. Not what happened while I was there, but what might have happened if I had stayed just one more night. It was the summer of 1998 when I decided to leave the city for a while. I was 29 then, tired of the noise, the lights, and the constant rush that never seemed to end. I had been saving money for months, not for a vacation, but for something I had always wanted to do: build a small cabin somewhere quiet, away from everyone. I found a cheap piece of land just outside a small town in northern Oregon. It wasn't much, just a few acres of wet soil, surrounded by tall pine trees and uneven terrain, but it was enough for me. I wanted a place I could build with my own hands. The first few days went smooth. I pitched a tent near the edge of the property and unloaded the supplies from my old pickup truck. The days were warm, the air smelled like pine and wet bark, and the only sounds were the birds and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. Felt peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I cleared out a small area with my hatchet, enough space to build a simple one-room cabin. I worked from sunrise to sundown, cutting planks, digging, setting up a frame. My hands blistered and my back ached, but I didn't mind. I was building something that was mine. By the fourth day, the weather started to change. The air grew thick, the sky heavy and gray. I could tell it was going to rain soon. I pushed through anyway, wanting to get the roof frame up before it came. Around mid-afternoon, thunder rolled in the distance, low and dull like something dragging across the sky. I worked faster, hammering nails into the beams as the wind began to move through the trees, making them sway and creak. By the time I nailed down the last piece of plywood, the rain came down hard. It wasn't just a light shower. It was the kind of rain that hit the ground like stones, soaking through everything. I ran to the tent, ducking under the half-built frame of the cabin. The dirt was already turning to mud beneath my boots. I sat inside the tent, drenched and shivering, listening to the sound of rain hitting the tarp. I had planned for this. I had food, dry clothes, even a small propane stove, but I couldn't shake a strange uneasiness. The forest looked different in the rain. The shadows stretched longer, the trees looked darker, and the wind carried strange noises that echoed through the woods. As the night came, the rain didn't stop. It got heavier. The sound was deafening, and the tent started to sag under the weight of the water. I lit my lantern, the faint orange glow barely cutting through the dark. I ate a can of beans straight from the tin and tried to calm myself. I told myself it was just weather, just part of being out here alone. I was fine, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed how quiet it got between the wind gusts. No frogs, no crickets, no owls, just the rain and the constant hum of wind through the trees. Sometime near midnight, I heard something snap outside. It wasn't thunder or wind. It sounded like a stick breaking, close by. I froze, my hands still holding the lantern. I listened, heart pounding hard enough I could hear it in my ears. A few seconds later, there was another sound. This time it was heavier, like something stepping in mud. I held my breath, The rain masked most sounds, but I could tell it wasn't far. Maybe 20 or 30 feet away, near the cabin frame. I tried to reason with myself. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon scavenging around the supplies. I wanted to believe that, but the steps sounded slow, deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the small hatchet I kept beside me. The footsteps stopped after a few moments. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I waited, staring at the tent walls as the rain dripped down them in thin lines. After what felt like an hour, I finally heard it again, this time moving away, deeper into the trees. I didn't move until I was sure it was gone. I barely slept that night. Every time the wind shifted or a branch cracked, I jolted awake, waiting to hear those steps again. By morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Everything was soaked, the tent, the tools, even the lumber. The ground was a mess of mud and puddles. My nerves were still shot, but I tried to shake it off. I got up, stretched, and checked around the site. That's when I saw it. Near the cabin frame, where I had left a pile of wood, there were footprints in the mud. Not boots, bare feet. They were deep, clear, and too large to be mine. I crouched down, staring at them. They came from the tree line, stopped near the cabin, and turned back the same way. My stomach twisted. I didn't know what to make of it. The prints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either, probably made sometime during the night. I told myself it had to be someone from the nearby town, maybe a local who wandered through, maybe someone curious about the construction. Still, the idea that someone had been walking barefoot in the middle of a storm in the woods didn't make sense. I decided to keep working anyway, even though I felt uneasy the whole time. The rain returned by late afternoon, this time heavier than before. The sky turned a flat, dark gray, and the forest went almost black. I worked as long as I could until the light faded, then went back into the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound made me tense up. The water dripping from the roof, the wind brushing against the canvas, the creaks from the half-finished frame outside. When I finally fell asleep, I woke up again to a new sound. A slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled across wet ground. It came from behind the tent, faint but steady. I sat up instantly, my pulse racing. I turned off the lantern light, trying to listen. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, this time closer. My hands were shaking. I grabbed the hatchet and unzipped the tent just enough to look out. The rain had eased a little, but the forest was still covered in fog. I couldn't see much beyond the cabin frame. Then, for a second, I thought I saw movement, a dark shape near the pile of wood. It wasn't clear, just a shadow against the gray rain. It didn't move like an animal, though. It was slow, careful. I shut the tent flap and sat there, staring at the fabric, too scared to move. The dragging sound faded again after a while, replaced by the heavy patter of rain. By morning, the ground was flooded. I stepped out into the mud, cold and tired. I checked the area again, and this time I found something else. One of the boards from the pile had been moved several feet away. It was half buried in mud, with a thin streak across it like it had been dragged. I didn't know what to think anymore. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe an animal tried to move it. But the prints were there again, bare feet, leading away toward the trees. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed my gear, loaded everything back into the truck, and didn't look back. The cabin frame still stood there in the rain, half-finished, crooked against the trees. I drove back to town, mud splashing under the tires, the forest fading behind me. I came back a week later with a friend from the hardware store to collect the rest of my supplies. The weather was clear then, the air still damp but quiet. When we got to the clearing, the cabin frame was gone. The boards were scattered all over the ground, some broken, some missing. The tent was torn, collapsed into the mud. It looked like someone had gone through everything and dragged it apart. There were no tracks that day, no prints in the ground, just the marks of something heavy being moved around. I didn't say anything. We loaded what was left into the truck and drove away. I never returned to that land again. Now, years later, every time it rains hard at night, I still think about that place. The sound of the dragging, the footprints, the feeling of someone just outside the tent. I don't know who or what it was, and maybe I never will. But I know one thing for sure. Something was there that night, and it didn't want me building anything in those woods. It was late autumn of 1998 when I decided to spend a few nights alone at my uncle's old cabin near a graveyard just outside a small town called Ormsby in northern Pennsylvania. The place had been left unused for almost 10 years, sitting right beside a narrow dirt road that curved along the edge of an old cemetery. I didn't plan it as some thrill-seeking adventure or anything like that. I just wanted silence. My mind had been worn out from city noise and long work hours, and I thought that a few nights out there would help me reset. The cabin was basic, no phone signal, no electricity, and just a small wood stove for heat. When I reached the place around noon, the air felt heavier than usual for that time of year. The sky was dull gray, not cloudy enough for rain but not clear either. The graveyard stretched behind the cabin, fenced off with rusted iron bars that leaned in different directions. Some of the gravestones were broken and tilted, half buried under layers of dead leaves and tangled weeds. The cabin itself was smaller than I remembered from when I was younger. The wood was cracked and faded gray, and the windows had a layer of grime that dulled the light inside. I unlocked the door, and it made a dry creaking sound that echoed for a few seconds. The inside smelled of damp wood and old ashes. There was a single bed pushed against the far wall, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a cracked mirror, and a small stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the early 90s. Dust floated in the air, thick enough to see in the light from the window. I set my bag down and took a slow walk around the place. It was silent except for the soft rustling of leaves outside. After getting settled, I walked toward the graveyard. The ground there was soft, covered with wet soil and fallen leaves that stuck to my boots. The air felt colder near the gravestones. The cemetery wasn't large, maybe 50-60 graves, most of them so old that the names were unreadable. A few headstones had small American flags beside them, their colors washed out from years of weather. There was an old caretaker's shed at the far end, half collapsed, its roof caved in. The wooden fence creaked when the wind moved through it, making a faint rhythmic sound. That first night was quiet. I made a small fire in the stove, heated a can of beans, and sat near the window, watching the trees sway under the faint moonlight. The graveyard was just barely visible through the glass, faint shapes of stone sticking up from the ground like crooked teeth. Around midnight, I started hearing faint thumps outside. I told myself it was just animals, maybe raccoons or stray dogs. The sound would stop, then return, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. It wasn't constant enough to worry about, but it made sleep hard. I finally dozed off sometime after 2 a.m., listening to the soft creak of the old wood above me. The second day, I explored a bit farther. Behind the graveyard, there was a narrow path that led into the woods. The ground there was uneven, with roots twisting out of the soil. I found an old rusted wheelbarrow half buried in the dirt and a few wooden crosses lying on the ground. It looked like someone had started digging there years ago but abandoned it. The smell of damp earth was strong, almost metallic. I didn't stay long. When I came back, I noticed fresh prints in the mud near the cabin steps. Not animal prints, but boots. The size was similar to mine, maybe a little larger. They weren't there when I arrived. That evening, the air turned colder. The wind picked up and whistled through the trees, making the windows rattle slightly. I stayed inside most of the night, sitting near the fire, trying to read an old magazine I found in a drawer. But I kept hearing small noises outside. A branch snapping, a soft scrape against the wood, something shifting the leaves near the porch. I went to the window a few times, but the darkness was thick, and my reflection blocked most of the view. I told myself it was animals again, maybe a deer wandering too close. When I tried to sleep, the noises got sharper. It sounded like someone walking very slowly around the cabin, the crunch of leaves measured and steady. I could hear it moving from one side to the other. Then silence. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, feeling my pulse in my ears. After about half an hour, I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it through the window. The beam caught nothing but empty ground and the faint outlines of gravestones. But just before I turned the light off, I noticed something near the edge of the graveyard. A darker patch among the trees, like someone standing very still. I stayed awake the rest of that night. By morning, I was exhausted, and the light coming through the window looked harsh and cold. I stepped outside, walked toward the spot where I thought I'd seen that shape, but there was nothing, just trees and the damp smell of old soil. The only thing I found was a piece of fabric stuck on a branch, dark blue, maybe from a jacket. It was torn at the edge and looked recently snagged. I decided to leave that evening. I'd only planned for 2 nights anyway, but the unease that had been building since the first day made me want to go sooner. I packed my things slowly, making sure everything was sealed in my bag. Around sunset, I made one last walk around the place to make sure I didn't forget anything. The light was fading fast, and the graveyard looked even more twisted under the orange glow. I noticed new footprints near the fence, same size as before, but now they led toward the cabin, then disappeared into the woods behind it. When I started the car, it took a few tries to turn over. I could feel the air around me growing colder, heavy with that same damp smell from the graveyard. As I looked up through the windshield, I saw someone standing near the fence, far enough away that I couldn't see their face clearly, but close enough that I knew it wasn't an illusion. They weren't moving, just standing there, half hidden by a tree. I didn't wait to see more. I pressed the gas and drove down the dirt road, not looking back again. About 15 minutes later, I reached the main road. The sight of asphalt and power lines felt almost unreal after those days of silence. I stopped at a small diner on the way back to town, just to clear my head and calm my hands. When I looked at my rearview mirror, I noticed dirt on my jacket sleeve, like someone had grabbed it. I didn't remember brushing against anything. A few weeks later, I heard from a local friend that someone had been living out near that graveyard for a while. A drifter, maybe in his late 40s. People had seen him sleeping in the old caretaker's shed, digging through the graves at night, collecting metal and tools. The sheriff had gone to check, but the man was gone by then. They found piles of disturbed soil and footprints leading toward the woods. I never went back to that cabin again. The key is still in a drawer at home, rusting quietly. Sometimes when I wake up late at night, I remember the sound of those slow footsteps circling the cabin, and the way the figure stood still near the fence. Not hiding, not running, just watching. And every time I think about it, I realize that what unsettled me most wasn't the graveyard or the silence. It was knowing that someone had been there all along, moving just outside the edge of the light, waiting for something I never stayed long enough to understand. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in rural Iowa. He had passed away years ago, and the property had been left mostly untouched since then. Just a few acres of land, a collapsing barn, and a weather-beaten cabin at the far end of a dirt path that curved through yellowing cornfields. I had taken a short break from my construction job in Omaha and wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere away from people and city noise. That cabin seemed like the perfect place for that. The drive there took me nearly 6 hours. By the time I reached the property, the sun was already dropping behind the fields, and the air had that cold, dry bite that comes at the start of autumn. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered from my childhood. The paint had peeled off most of the siding. The windows were streaked with dust and spider webs, and the porch boards were warped and soft in places. The whole thing leaned slightly to one side, like it had given up resisting the years. I parked my truck beside the old barn. Its roof had partially caved in, and a rusted tractor sat inside like a skeleton of something once useful. The fields around the property were overgrown, not properly harvested in years. Wild grass mixed with corn stalks that had grown out of pattern. The ground uneven from burrowing animals and years of neglect. I could smell the faint sourness of old soil and dry hay mixed with the heavy, earthy scent of damp wood. Inside, the cabin was musty and cold. Dust coated the furniture and thick cobwebs hung from the corners. There was a small kitchen area, a single bedroom, and a narrow hallway that led to a back door. The floorboards creaked loudly under my boots. I dropped my bag on the table, took a deep breath, and started opening the windows to air it out. The hinges whined with every push. That first night was quiet except for the sound of wind through the dry corn. It was a different kind of silence than the city, thicker, almost pressing. I had brought my dog, Tucker, a brown mixed breed who usually barked at every small sound. But that night he was unusually still. He just sat by the door, staring through the dark toward the fields. I figured it was just the new surroundings. The next morning, I woke early and walked around the property. The barn was worse than I thought. The back wall had fallen inward, and something had dragged a deep trail through the dirt floor, leading out the side door. It looked like someone had tried to move a heavy object, but the prints were old, dried out. Probably just an animal. I didn't think much of it. I spent most of the day cleaning the cabin, burning old trash in a rusty barrel out back, and cutting some of the tall weeds around the porch. The more I worked, the more I felt a strange sense of being watched. The nearest neighbor was a few miles away, and the road leading in was long and empty, but every now and then I'd catch a movement at the edge of the fields, like someone ducking behind the tall stalks. I'd stop, squint, and see nothing. The corn swayed in the wind, and I'd tell myself it was just that. That night, the wind picked up and the cabin groaned. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Not just the wind this time. It was a slow, steady sound, like steps on the porch. Tucker started growling low, his fur raised along his back. I sat still on the bed, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps stopped near the front door, and then came a soft scrape, metal against wood. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed, turned it on, and aimed it at the door. Nothing, just silence again. I stayed awake most of the night listening. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, farther away this time, something moving out near the barn. I told myself it was probably raccoons or coyotes. The old place was surrounded by wild animals. The next day I went to check. The ground was soft from a bit of overnight rain, and I saw prints near the barn, barefoot prints. Human. The size looked strange, though. Too narrow, and the toes seemed longer than normal. I followed them for a while until they disappeared into the weeds near the tree line. That uneasy feeling stayed in my gut all day. I didn't sleep well the next few nights. Tucker kept waking up, growling toward the window, and every time I'd look, I'd see nothing. The feeling of being watched never went away. On the 4th night, I heard something drag along the side of the cabin. It sounded like a heavy branch or maybe a piece of metal scraping along the wood. It stopped near the back door. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, holding my breath. In the morning, I saw fresh scratches near the back door. Long, uneven gouges like someone had dragged a knife down the surface. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the fields, but there was nothing except the slow rustling of corn. By the end of the week, I had started keeping a hatchet beside the bed. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the thought that someone was coming around at night, maybe a squatter or some local kid messing around. Still, the remoteness of the place made that unlikely. One afternoon, I drove into town for supplies. The old man at the gas station recognized the address when I mentioned where I was staying. He said nobody had lived there since 2004, after some farmhand who worked for my uncle disappeared one night. They never found him, only his truck abandoned by the cornfield. The sheriff had blamed it on him running off, but locals thought otherwise. I didn't ask more. I didn't want to know. When I got back that evening, I noticed something wrong. The front door was open, just slightly, but it hadn't been that way when I left. Tucker refused to go inside. He stood on the porch whining quietly. I checked every room. Everything looked untouched except for one thing. The back door was unlocked. I knew I'd locked it. That night, I moved a chair against the front door and kept the hatchet within reach. Around 1 a.m, I heard it again. Slow, uneven footsteps outside. Then the sound of breathing, low, almost wheezing, right outside the wall where my bed was. I could hear the boards creak under its weight as it moved along the porch. Tucker didn't bark this time. He just stared at the wall, his whole body stiff, tail low. I forced myself to stay quiet. After a minute, the sound faded. I waited another 10 before I moved. I got up slowly, went to the window and looked out. The moonlight made the cornfields look silver. And that's when I saw it. Something tall standing between the rows. It wasn't moving. It just stood there facing the cabin. I couldn't make out details, only the shape. The proportions looked wrong. The arms seemed too long, and the head tilted slightly to one side. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. The next morning, I packed. I didn't even eat breakfast. I loaded everything back into the truck, called Tucker, and was ready to go. But before leaving, I looked back one last time at the cabin. The chair I had placed against the front door was lying on its side, and there were wet footprints on the porch boards, bare feet, same as before. I drove until the cabin was nothing but a speck in the rearview mirror. A week later, I got a call from the county sheriff. They'd found the cabin broken into again. The back door was wide open, and the inside was torn apart. Furniture smashed, walls scraped down to the wood. He asked if I knew anyone who might have gone there. I didn't. I never went back. The land was eventually sold off to some development company, and the cabin was demolished. But sometimes I still think about those footprints and the figure standing in the cornfield. There was no ghost, no storybook monster, just something real enough to leave tracks, to scratch the walls, to stand there in the dark watching me breathe. And what haunts me most is the thought that maybe it had been living there long before I arrived. Maybe it had never left. It was early October, the kind of month in the United Kingdom when the wind carried a chill that never really went away. I had taken a few days off from work and rented a small wooden cabin near the edge of a quiet forest in Cumbria, not far from the Lake District. The listing had described it as a remote countryside retreat, perfect for people who wanted to disconnect. That was exactly what I needed after a rough few months. I packed light, some clothes, food supplies, a flashlight, and my dog, a brown mixed breed named Milo. The cabin stood alone off a narrow gravel road, surrounded by tall, thin trees that made the place feel closed off from the world. It had that old wooden smell when I first walked in, damp timber mixed with dust and faint traces of smoke from the old fireplace. The floorboards creaked when I stepped on them, and the only sound outside was the wind brushing against the trees. I thought it was peaceful at first. That first evening, I lit the small stove, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the old sofa with Milo lying on the rug by my feet. The place was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual forest sounds, like birds or crickets, seemed distant. I tried not to think much of it and turned in early, listening to the rain start to tap against the tin roof as I fell asleep. Around 2 a.m., Milo started growling softly. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to wake me. He stood facing the front door, his fur slightly raised. I didn't hear anything, but he was staring intensely, ears forward. I turned on the small lamp beside the bed and looked around, my heart beating a bit faster. Nothing, just the sound of rain. I told myself it was probably a fox or deer outside, something Milo wasn't used to. Still, it took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, the fog was thick outside. The trees were barely visible, and the grass was heavy with dew. I went out to check the area around the cabin, mostly to reassure myself there wasn't anything strange going on. The ground near the front steps was muddy, and that's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints, bare ones, small, like from a woman's feet. They led from the trees toward the cabin, stopping near the porch before turning back into the woods. They weren't fresh, maybe from the night before. I crouched down, staring at them, feeling a coldness in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had been hiking or camping nearby and got lost. Still, it made no sense why someone would be barefoot in the middle of the cold night in wet mud. I brushed it off and went inside, but for the rest of the morning, I couldn't shake the unease. By the second night, the fog had cleared, and the air felt sharper. I had started to relax again, convincing myself it was nothing. Around sunset, I took Milo for a short walk near the tree line. The forest was quiet except for the wind, and as the sky darkened, I noticed how fast the shadows spread between the trees. When we got back to the cabin, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. On the porch railing, someone had left a single old shoe. It was worn, dirty, and looked like it had been sitting in mud for a long time. A woman's shoe, maybe size 6 or 7. I stared at it for a while, trying to make sense of it. I felt a tingle crawl up my neck. I didn't touch it. I went inside, locked the door, and shut every curtain in the place. Milo was uneasy again, pacing near the window. That night, I barely slept. I heard faint sounds outside now and then, soft movements, the kind you can't tell if they're human or animal. Once or twice, I thought I heard slow footsteps in the gravel outside. By morning, I was exhausted. I walked out onto the porch carefully, and the shoe was gone. The mud near the steps had fresh prints again, the same size and shape. I decided to cut my trip short, but the nearest town was miles away, and my phone signal was barely there. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning after packing everything. The final night was colder than before. The sky was cloudy, and the wind had picked up enough to make the cabin walls creak faintly. I tried reading to distract myself, but every sound outside made me look up. Milo was lying near the fireplace, half asleep but occasionally raising his head like he heard something I didn't. Around midnight, the power flickered and went out completely. The cabin went dark except for the faint orange glow from the dying fire. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and moved to the window. I pointed the light outside, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone near the edge of the clearing. The beam barely reached that far, but I could make out a pale shape standing still between 2 trees. It looked like a woman, tall and thin, wearing something light-colored, maybe a nightgown or a long dress. Her hair looked messy, hanging over her shoulders. I froze. She didn't move. I kept the light on her, but after a moment, I blinked, and she was gone. Just gone. I felt my throat go dry. I turned off the flashlight, pulled Milo close, and waited. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat and the wind. I sat like that for hours listening, too afraid to move. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. the crunching sound of footsteps in the gravel. Slow, deliberate. Then the faint creak of the porch wood. Milo stood up, growling low. I didn't dare turn on the light this time. I just sat there, barely breathing. After a while, the sound stopped. At first light, I opened the door carefully. The air was freezing, my hands shaking slightly. There were new footprints again, this time directly on the porch steps, leading right up to the door, and they were smaller than mine, barefoot again and wet. Next to them was a smudge on the wood, like a handprint. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even bother cleaning up or eating breakfast. As I loaded my things into the car, I noticed something farther out near the trees. It was the same woman. She was standing there, still and quiet, half hidden behind the trunk of a birch tree. Her skin looked pale, and her eyes were fixed on me. She wasn't moving toward me, just watching. I got in the car, slammed the door shut, and drove off down that narrow gravel road without looking back. My heart was pounding the whole way until I reached the main road miles away. When I got back home later that day, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I told myself it was probably someone living rough out there, maybe mentally unstable, wandering the woods. It made the most sense, but even that didn't explain everything. The footprints, the handprint, the way she seemed to appear and vanish in the dark. Weeks later, I looked up the area online, just out of curiosity. There were a few mentions on old forums about people seeing a strange barefoot woman near those woods, always around dusk, always silent. Some said she lived somewhere deep in the forest, surviving off whatever she could find. Others said nothing at all, just warnings to avoid the area after dark. I never went back to that cabin. I still remember the smell of the damp wood, the sound of the wind through the trees, and that pale figure half hidden in the fog. Sometimes, when I take Milo out at night, and I hear footsteps that aren't mine on the gravel path behind us, I still find myself glancing back, half expecting to see her standing there again, barefoot, silent, watching. It was the middle of November, 2018, when I decided to spend a few days alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. The place was about 12 miles from the nearest paved road, down a dirt trail that wound between dark trees and patches of frozen mud. I was 29 then, tired from work, tired of noise, tired of people. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be completely alone for a while. The cabin had no phone service, no internet, and the nearest house was probably 8 or 9 miles away. I figured that isolation would clear my head. When I first got there, it was still light. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and a half-frozen creek running just behind it. The structure looked tired but solid. Rough wooden walls, an old tin roof, a short front porch with a single chair that creaked when I sat on it. The smell of pine and cold air was sharp, clean. Inside, everything was simple. A wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, a cot, some shelves with canned food, and a small window that looked toward the treeline. Dust covered almost everything, and the air had that stale, shut-in smell like something that hadn't been opened in months. I unpacked my bag, stacked some firewood near the stove, and swept the floor. I remember thinking how quiet it was. So quiet that even the wind sounded loud when it brushed through the trees. By the second evening, I'd started to notice how different the woods felt when the sun went down. The temperature dropped fast after dusk, and the silence became heavier. I could hear every tiny noise, every creak of the cabin's walls, every snap of a branch outside, every drip of melting frost sliding off the roof. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the forest settling for the night. But that night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard something outside, something like slow, heavy steps on the ground, crunching the frost just beyond the porch. It wasn't an animal running or scurrying. It was deliberate, like a person walking. I stayed still on the cot, barely breathing, my heart pounding so loud it almost hurt. The sound moved past the cabin and faded toward the woods. I told myself it was probably a deer, but deer don't usually walk like that. In the morning, I went outside and looked around. The frost was thick, and near the edge of the clearing, I saw tracks. Not boots, not animal prints, just deep marks in the frozen dirt. They looked like someone had been wearing thick socks or walked barefoot, the shape of toes faintly visible. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hunter? But who would be walking barefoot out here in the cold? It didn't sit right, but I brushed it off, stacked more wood, and spent the day hiking a short way along the creek. The whole time I felt watched. That uneasy feeling crept up on me, even in daylight. Every time I stopped, the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if something out there was waiting for me to move again. That night, I made sure the door was locked and wedged a chair under the handle. The wind had picked up, whistling through cracks in the walls. Around midnight again, the noise started. First faint, a slow dragging sound, like something being pulled through the dirt. Then soft thuds, uneven footsteps circling the cabin. I stayed completely still, staring at the ceiling, listening. The steps stopped right outside the wall near my bed. The wood made a low creak, like something leaned against it. Then silence. My skin felt tight, like it was shrinking around me. I stayed that way for hours until I finally dozed off from exhaustion. The next morning, I checked outside again. There were marks all around the cabin, long smeared lines in the frost, mixed with those same bare prints. The ground looked disturbed, like someone had been crawling on it or dragging their feet around. I started to feel sick just looking at it. I packed some things in case I decided to leave, but I told myself to last one more night. It was already late afternoon, and the road out was rough and narrow, too dangerous to drive in the dark. That evening, I built a stronger fire and moved my cot closer to the stove. The sound of the wind had grown constant, moaning through the trees. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, like it hadn't moved in hours. Around 10, I killed the lantern and lay there in the dark, only the firelight flickering across the walls. For a while, it was quiet. Then, faintly, I heard the crunch of footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, like before. They came from the woods and stopped at the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, staring toward the window, trying to see any shape outside. The footsteps began again, moving toward the porch, slow and steady. The boards creaked as weight pressed on them. I could hear breathing, slow and heavy, right outside the door. My whole body locked up. I thought about shouting, but there was no point. No one would hear me out there. After a minute, the sound moved to the window. The firelight flickered against the wall, and for a second, I saw a shadow pass by the glass. A shape, tall and narrow. The breathing sounded rough, like someone struggling quietly. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then, a slow scraping sound ran along the wall. Maybe a hand, maybe something else dragging across the wood. It circled the cabin again, then faded toward the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat by the fire, staring at the window, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, I threw everything in my bag and loaded my truck. I didn't even eat. Before leaving, I walked around the cabin one last time. The frost was disturbed everywhere, but near the trees, I saw something that made me stop cold. A small pile of clothes, half buried under leaves. They looked old, stiff with dirt and frost, but there was a torn jacket that could have belonged to anyone. I didn't touch them. I just turned and got in the truck. The road out felt twice as long as it had coming in. I kept checking the mirrors, convinced something was following me. Once I reached the paved road, I finally breathed properly again. I drove straight to town, filled up on gas, and called my uncle from a diner. He told me no one had been up to that cabin in years. I didn't tell him what I saw. I didn't want to explain it. A few days later, I called a local ranger's office and mentioned the tracks, saying I thought maybe someone was camping illegally near the area. They said they'd check it out. About a week passed before I got a call back. The ranger said they found the cabin, but there were no signs of anyone there. He said there were animal tracks, though maybe a black bear, judging from the size. I didn't argue, but bears don't walk on two legs all night, circling a cabin. And they sure don't leave piles of clothes behind. I never went back there. The cabin's probably still standing, rotting slowly under the weight of snow and rain. Sometimes I think about those tracks and that sound, the slow dragging steps around the walls. I can still hear them when I wake up at night, half dreaming, when everything's quiet and still. I tell myself it was probably some drifter, maybe lost or sick, wandering the woods. But deep down, I know what I heard. Those steps weren't random. They were careful. They were measured. Whoever or whatever was out there that night wasn't lost. It knew exactly where I was. It was late October 2011. The air had that sharp, dry chill that only comes right before winter really sets in. I'd been driving for almost 6 hours through the endless woods of northern Minnesota, following a narrow 2-lane road that seemed to disappear deeper and deeper into nowhere. I was heading to an old hunting cabin that used to belong to my uncle, a place I hadn't been to in years. He'd passed away a few months earlier, and since then, nobody had been out there. I wanted to check on the place, maybe clean it up, see if it was still in shape for hunting season. By the time I got there, the sun had already dipped behind the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pines so tall they almost swallowed the sky. The wooden structure looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged a little, and the porch steps creaked when I tested them with my boot. The windows were fogged with grime, and a layer of dead leaves had gathered against the siding. It looked lonely, like it had been waiting for someone who never showed up. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. A mix of dust, old wood, and faint mildew. The air was cold and stale. Everything was as it had been years ago. A small kitchen area with a rusted stove, a single bedroom off to the right, and a main room with a stone fireplace and a few hunting trophies mounted on the wall. I dropped my duffel bag near the table and stood there for a moment, listening. There was nothing. No wind, no crickets, not even the sound of the woods outside. Just complete silence. I started unpacking slowly, my boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. My uncle's old things were still there. His coat hanging by the door, his boots lined up beside the wall. A half-empty bottle of whiskey still sat on the counter, covered in dust. I wiped my hand along the table and felt a thick layer of dirt and grit stick to my palm. It was clear nobody had been here since the last time he was. As the night settled in, I lit a few candles since the power had been cut off years ago. The dim yellow light made the cabin look even smaller. I found some old canned food in a cabinet and made a rough meal of beans and crackers. Then I sat by the fireplace, which I managed to get going with a few dry logs from the woodshed. The firelight flickered over the walls, catching the mounted deer heads and the shadowed corners of the room. I could hear the logs crackle and shift as the flames grew stronger. Outside, the woods had gone completely dark. The only sound was the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. I remember sitting there, staring into the flames, trying not to think too much about how far I was from anyone. The closest town was over 30 miles away. If something happened out here, no one would know for days. Later that night, I stepped outside to take a piss. The air was freezing, and I could see my breath cloud in front of me. The woods around the clearing were black. Not just dark, but completely lightless, like walls closing in from every side. I stood there listening again. That same silence. It was so thick it felt unnatural. Not even an owl or a cricket. It's strange how silence can feel louder than any noise when you're out there alone. When I turned to go back inside, I noticed something near the edge of the clearing. It was faint at first, a shape, or maybe just a shadow standing near the tree line. I squinted but couldn't make it out. It didn't move. I thought maybe it was just a tree stump or my eyes playing tricks on me. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, watching it, before shaking my head and going back inside. I told myself it was nothing, just the dark messing with my eyes. But when I went back to the window and looked again, I didn't see anything. Still, the unease wouldn't leave. Felt like something was out there, watching. I tried to brush it off and went to bed on the small cot in the bedroom. The mattress springs groaned under my weight. I left the candle burning on the table beside me because I didn't like how dark it got once the fire died down. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, but then I heard something. A sound so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. It was a soft crunch of leaves outside, slow and deliberate. My heart started thumping. I held still, listening again. Another crunch, then another. Something was moving through the clearing. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and went to the window. The candlelight barely reached the glass. When I peered out, I couldn't see anything, just the outlines of trees and the faint reflection of my own face. But the sound didn't stop. It moved slowly around the cabin, one side to the other, pausing every few seconds. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. After a few minutes, the sound stopped completely. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. I must have stood there for 10 minutes before I finally forced myself to move. I grabbed the rifle that was hanging above the door. It was my uncle's old .30-06, heavy and a bit rusty, but loaded. I checked it twice, then sat by the window for what felt like hours. The woods stayed quiet. By morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The sun came up pale and weak through the trees. When I stepped outside, I looked for tracks around the cabin. At first, I didn't see anything, but near the side of the porch, the dirt was disturbed. The soil there was soft, and I could make out impressions that weren't from boots. They were barefoot, long, thin shapes pressed deep into the earth. Human, but strange looking, like someone had been walking slowly around the cabin with bare feet in the cold. I felt my stomach twist. No animal left prints like that. Someone had been there, watching. The rest of the day, I tried to keep myself busy. Chopped some wood, cleaned out the cabin a bit, anything to keep my mind off it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often I thought I saw movement between the trees, just at the edge of my sight. Whenever I looked directly, it was gone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the main room with the fire going and the rifle across my lap. The candle burned down to a stub. Around midnight, it started again. Faint footsteps outside. This time closer. I could hear them on the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I aimed the rifle toward the door and waited. The handle never moved, and the steps never came inside. But they stayed there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, shifting, pacing. Then they stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't move for the rest of the night. When daylight came again, I packed up my things. I didn't even eat breakfast. I went outside just long enough to lock the door behind me and check the porch. More prints. Same barefoot marks, darker this time, like whoever it was had been standing there for a while, watching the door. As I started the truck and drove away, I looked back once through the side mirror. The cabin stood quiet in the clearing, smoke still rising faintly from the chimney. But just before the trees closed around the road, I thought I saw something standing near the edge of the clearing again. Tall, motionless, watching. I didn't stop. I kept driving until the cabin disappeared completely behind the trees. I never went back after that. The keys still hang on my wall at home, a small reminder of that night. A few months later, I sold the land to a logging company. They said they'd tear the cabin down before the next season. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about it. The cold air, the silence, those prints in the dirt. And every time I picture that dark clearing in my head, I remember how quiet it was out there. Like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting.